Success is a fickle thing. Some people will struggle their whole life looking for that one idea that will make them millionaires, while others will simply stumble upon it on their first try. The latter is the case for Scott Adams, the person who made a fortune off his comic strip Dilbert. What makes this man so interesting to me, though, is that he could have easily coasted off that success for his entire life, but he instead decided to devote his time to multiple other business ventures, which each failed in their own unique ways. And eventually, even his crowning achievement would come crumbling down due to nobody's fault but his own. This is the story of Scott Adams and the death of Dilbert. Scott Adams was born on June 8, 1957 in Windham, New York. He remained in his hometown for most of his youth, attending the nearby Hartwick College after high school. During this time, he claims that his newfound love of drinking and partying had caused his grades to decline and thus put him in danger of losing his scholarship. Bad turned to worse when he came down with the most severe case of mono that the school's nursing staff had ever seen. At this point, he was reportedly encouraged to drop out since there was no way he could continue his studies in the condition he was in. But Adams stood firm and persevered through the crippling fatigue caused by the illness. Not only did he manage to stay on top of his schoolwork, but he actually improved his grades and got a month ahead of the rest of the class in their reading. Now, it's entirely possible that this story is true, as is the case with all anecdotes that the cartoonist has told about himself. But it's important to establish early on that Scott Adams is a classic example of a boy who cried wolf. He has been known to exaggerate reality or simply make things up whole cloth. But that's not just my assertion. As stated in his own words from his book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, it's hard to know when a cartoonist is being serious and when they are constructing an elaborate practical joke. I've crafted pranks that span years, sometimes when no one was in on the joke but me. Some of those pranks are still percolating. I have posed as other people online and even in person. I've written opinions I don't actually hold just to see what reaction I would get. In order to fully understand the story of Scott Adams, one must accept that the line between truth and fiction is inherently blurred. Another example of this from his early years came soon after his college graduation, when he made the decision to move to sunny California after his car broke down on a remote New York road in the middle of winter, and he nearly froze to death. It is a fact that he flew across the country and enrolled at UC Berkeley in order to earn his MBA. During his time, he began working as a teller at Crocker National Bank. Adams claims that while he was at this job, he was held at gunpoint on 2 separate occasions. It's worth noting that no sources can be found to back up this claim, and in recent years he has increased that number from 2 to 5. Unsatisfied with his supposedly very dangerous position at the bank, Adams decided to try climbing up the corporate ladder, sending a list of potential ideas for improving the company to his direct superior. Shockingly, despite the fact that these ideas were bad even by his own admission, the young college student was fast-tracked onto Crocker National Bank's management training program. However, his blossoming career was cut short when he was informed that he could not be promoted further since he was a white man, and the corporation was attempting to increase its diversity. Again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, keep in mind that the only source for these claims is what Adams has written. This will be important later on. But whatever the reason was for his stalled career progress at Crocker, Scott decided to move to a new job at the Pacific Bell Telephone Company after earning his master's. Unfortunately, he was soon met with the exact same career hurdle, unable to advance any further due to his race and gender. It was at this point that Adams decided it was time for a change. He wasn't particularly passionate about the corporate world anyway. If they didn't want him, he would forge his own path. But before we go any further with this video, I just want to give a shout out to my company, 1UP. I know it's been a while since I talked about it, but that's because we were running low on inventory and I had to wait until we were fully back in stock. For those that aren't aware, this is a high quality all-in-one face cream that I've spent the last 2 years developing with my team. 1UP moisturizes, boosts, strengthens, protects, and tones skin all in one bottle. So instead of having to use 5 or 6 different creams every single day, I just put this on and I'm good to go. I know some people were confused about why I was involved in this project, but to be clear, this is my vision and I'm CEO of this company. That's not to say I don't get any professional help. It's co-owned by Dr. Deborah Bailey. She's a dermatologist with over 30 years of experience that also has the vision of simplifying skincare. So if you want to try 1UP for yourself, go to gotoneUp.com and use code GFM at checkout. And if you subscribe and save, you'll get 25% off your order, which makes it around 75 cents a day to use 1UP. Scott's strategy was to wake up at 4 a.m. every day before work and practice new skills which would potentially earn him a living. While most of these were duds, there was one that immediately jumped out as the most promising: cartooning.
Dilbert had been created as a character I used in my day job, and I would do little comics on my whiteboard in my cubicle. And sometimes I'd do presentations as part of my job, and I'd put in some comics that I drew. And they were kind of popular around the office, and pretty soon they started to get spread around the company.
The budding artist began submitting Dilbert to various publishing houses before finally getting signed to United Features Syndicate in 1989. These early strips were slightly different to the identity the comic would eventually take on, featuring only two main characters, the titular Dilbert and his pet named Dogbert. Dilbert's growth was slow at first, being published in just 100 newspapers in 1991. A couple years in, Adams began to include his newly made email address in the margins of each strip, at a time when most people didn't even know what that was. He credits much of his early success in the world of cartooning to this decision, as readers were able to reach out and tell him what direction they'd like to see the series go in. Specifically, many of these emailers showed a strong preference for comics which depicted Dilbert working at his office job, prompting Adams to lean more into that aspect of his creation. His years of experience dealing with corporate America had given him ample material to work with, and he was more than happy to put it to good use.
We just had a meeting and decided to change your project substantially. We didn't invite you to the meeting because things go smoother when nobody has any actual knowledge. So, what are the changes? If I remember, I'll leave you a voicemail.
This is when things really started to take off. As the comics' focus shifted to satire of office culture, more and more people began taking notice. In just a few short years, the Dilbert brand exploded in popularity from a humble comic strip to a pop culture juggernaut. And make no mistake, this was a brand. Those who weren't around during Dilbert's peak in the late 90s and early 2000s may find it hard to fathom what a phenomenon it was, as merchandise and comic strips adorned the walls of cubicles worldwide. This rise corresponds with the growing popularity of media satirizing corporate careers during the 90s, with films like Office Space and Falling Down releasing during this era as well. In just a few short years, Dilbert had reached the forefront of this growing movement. In his book, Adams writes about being a student in college dreaming about achieving success by creating something that was, quote, widely desired and easy to produce. It seemed with Dilbert he had found exactly what he was looking for. It's important to note that Dilbert's success was due to two major factors. While the first was obviously its relatability and mass appeal, luck and good timing also played a large part. What must be understood is the same year Dilbert was picked up by a publisher, the cartoonist Berkeley Breathed ended his acclaimed comic Bloom County. A few years later, in 1985, Bill Watterson also made the decision to step away from his creation, the widely beloved Calvin and Hobbes. Both of these comics were published in thousands of papers across the globe, and thus created a large vacuum upon their conclusions. And this was a vacuum Dilbert was more than able to fill. But not everyone was so thrilled about this meteoric rise. Bill Griffith, the cartoonist behind the absurdist comic strip Zippy the Pinhead, published an opinion piece lamenting the state of the newspaper comics page, in which he pointed to Dilbert as a prime example of the art form's decline. Dilbert is a marketing strategy. It's the most popular and successful new comic strip in America today. What does this tell us about the medium? The comic strip exists in the twilight zone where art meets commerce. Comic strips today seem more of a comfort than an artistic statement. They're there. And with a mind-numbing regularity, they'll be there, recycling the same diet jokes and lifestyle gags again and again, day after day. They're not really meant to be read. They're meant to be scanned, quickly absorbed, and just as quickly forgotten. While this comes off as a bit smug for a person talking about the funny page, Griffith's concerns weren't without merit. Zippy the Pinhead, Bloom County, and Calvin and Hobbes were all known for their detailed artwork and thoughtful writing. In the span of just a few short years, two of these comics were gone, replaced with a strip that seemed interested only in pumping out content, primarily focused on mass appeal. But Scott Adams obviously felt differently. In response to the op-ed, he published a series of Dilbert strips in which Dogbert creates his own comic titled Pippi the Ziphead. Adams used this as a vehicle to lay out all of his problems with Zippy. Mainly, he seemed to feel that the detailed artwork and non-sequitur writing style that Griffith took such pride in were simply the work of a bitter man making a comic that, quote, no one will enjoy. Bill, for his part, responded with his own comic strip, mocking Dilbert's simplistic art and writing style. While the beef fizzled out from there, two things had been proven. One, the landscape of the newspaper comics page had changed forever, and two, Scott Adams did not take kindly to mockery. It wasn't just other cartoonists expressing their frustration around this time either. As the Dilbert craze exploded in popularity nationwide, a man named Tristan Farron became increasingly annoyed seeing the cartoon character everywhere he went. In his own words, I've suffered through years of insipid Dilbert-related merchandise staring at me from other people's cubicles. I've worked on software projects codenamed Dogbert. It just got annoying. This annoyance eventually mutated into a burning, seething resentment that needed some form of release. Tristan went to his personal website and published The Dilbert Hole, a comic in which he took Scott Adams' drawings and edited out the dialogue, replacing it with the most vulgar things he could think of. Despite its relative obscurity, the site received a small cult fan base on the early internet from people who shared Farron's disdain for Dilbert. But a wrench was thrown into their fun when United Features Syndicate took notice of the Dilbert Hole and sent Farron a cease and desist. This struck many people as petty, considering that Tristan was far from the only person making fun of the cartoon office worker online. But what was truly baffling was the personal note that he received from Adams himself, asking him simply, do you want to go to jail? While it could have probably been argued in court that the Dilbert Hole fell under the umbrella of fair use, Tristan decided he didn't want to deal with the headache and simply deleted the comics from his site, at which point he was informed that United would be monitoring his web activity. The comics readers expressed their disappointment, catching the attention of the shock website Rotten.com. They reached out to Tristan and asked if they could host his creations on their platform, knowing full well what the potential legal ramifications could be. An agreement was reached and the Dilbert Hole found a new home. Of course, it wasn't long before they too were served with legal papers. While the Rotten admins ultimately decided to take down the comics as well, they still managed a small act of rebellion by replacing them with an image of the documents they had received. In response, United sent them another message ordering them to remove all mention of the Dilbert name from their websites, meaning that they were served legal papers over the previous legal papers. They complied, putting up an image of the new request with the name Dilbert censored and replaced with penis. This no doubt angered the cartoonist even further, but since Ron had technically honored the request of his lawyers, there was nothing he could do about it. Adams never responded to the situation further after this. But these events were merely blips on Scott's rise to prominence. As his comic gained popularity, the next logical step was to try adapting it into another medium, with many networks clamoring for the opportunity to produce a TV show based on the IP. Adams originally brokered a deal with Fox in '97 to create a live-action Dilbert series, although the project soon fell apart after just one pilot was filmed and never aired. Little is known about what this show would have been like. Even the cast lineup is not available, with it being lost media. This failure convinced Adams that the only way a Dilbert show could work was if it was animated. A deal was eventually signed with the small broadcaster UPN, with whom he believed he would have the largest amount of freedom to create whatever he wanted. And as a person who's watched through the entire thing, it's actually really solid, and I'd recommend checking it out if you're into adult animation. The project certainly had a fair amount of pedigree behind it, as Adams teamed up with Larry Charles, a writer who had been instrumental to Seinfeld during its early years, to help create it. When the first episode premiered in 1999, it received glowing reviews from both critics and audiences alike, who praised it for its cynical and satirical sense of humor similar to the original comic. By any measure, it seemed as though UPN had a hit on their hands, one that could potentially raise their standing significantly in the world of TV broadcasting. The thing is though, success is fickle in the entertainment industry, and Dilbert was cancelled the very next year after just 2 seasons on the air. Just a few years after that, UPN went defunct. In an interview from 2006, Adams reflected on many of the factors that led to the Dilbert show's failure. He primarily blamed the network's executives. In addition to the already low viewership of UPN, the show's time slot was repeatedly changed. He also cited the fact that Dilbert was aired after another program titled Shasta McNasty, which Scott described as, quote, the worst TV show ever made. If there was one thing made clear from this ordeal, it's that Scott Adams was ready to flex his creative muscles beyond the newspaper comics page, perhaps even beyond the confines of Dilbert. He started concocting a plan before approaching Pierluigi Zappacosta, the co-founder of Logitech, to help him pull off a prank at his company. The plan was simple. Adams would conduct a meeting with Logitech's executives in disguise as a corporate strategist and convince them to adopt the most convoluted mission statement he was able to concoct. Although most of this has been poorly archived, the process of transforming Scott Adams into this fake consultant was detailed in the San Jose Mercury News website. Taking on the pseudonym Ray Maybear, the cartoonist put on a wig, fake mustache, and some light makeup to sell the disguise. I don't see why he went through the hassle to do this personally though, as it's unlikely anyone would have recognized him either way. Accompanied by a camera crew and a journalist by the name of Tia O'Brien, Adams strolled into the meeting and began his act, diving into his idea for their new mission statement and accepting any and all pitches from the executives present in order to fill it with the largest amount of corporate jargon possible. By the end, the result was as follows. The new venture's mission is to scout profitable growth opportunities in relationships, both internally and externally, in emerging mission-inclusive markets, and explore new paradigms, and then filter and communicate and evangelize the findings. Adams then removed his disguise, revealing his scheme to the room of confused businessmen. It's unclear what exactly the point of this stunt was, though. By all accounts, it seems that the Logitech leaders were never going to adopt this new mission statement, but it's undeniable that Scott took great pride in it. Perhaps he was using it as proving ground that he was more than just a one-trick pony, more than just the Dilbert guy. It was also around this time that he started getting booked for public speaking gigs, which quickly took off as well and became a lucrative source of income in its own right. This, combined with the profits from the syndication and merchandising of Dilbert, meant that Adams now had a vast amount of money to do whatever he wanted with. Investing was the obvious way to go, and he purchased stakes in a few early dot-com bubble companies that ended up going nowhere, including proto-competitors to sites like YouTube and Postmates. He also put some of his savings into infamous disasters such as Enron and WorldCom. This was Scott's cue to take matters into his own hands and put more of a personal stake into the businesses he invested in. According to his autobiography, he had been constantly thinking up ideas for years, ranging from computer programs to office supplies. The vast majority of these concepts died before even getting started, either due to a lack of ability or difficulty getting a patent. But a couple of them actually managed to grow into something real, before crashing and burning on each occasion. Outside of cartooning, food was also one of the consistent interests for Adams. In the late 90s, he teamed up with a restaurateur named Stacy Belkin to create Stacy's Cafe, located in Pleasanton, California. It's important to note that Scott's role in this venture was purely financial, with Belkin handling the day-to-day managerial role. By all accounts, this business was quite successful, with high customer satisfaction and consistently strong revenue. A few years later, the owners decided it was time to expand to a second location. This is when the trouble started. When Stacy's at Waterford opened for business in Dublin, California in 2006, it wasn't long before the problems presented themselves. Belkin quickly became overwhelmed with her responsibilities managing both establishments. Needing someone to lead the charge on the new location, Adams nominated the best candidate he could think of: himself. Many people at the time, including Scott, pointed out the irony that a man who had made a career out of parodying incompetent bosses was now becoming one. As he stated in a blog post from this period, "I am highly experienced at making funny comics about managers. How hard could it be to transition from mocking idiots to being one?" What must be understood is that Adams had never hired employees to help with his comics business, and thus had zero experience managing any sort of staff. He would take suggestions from anyone, including employees, to simply people he was friends with, resulting in something of a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks mentality. To quote the restaurant's head chef from an interview conducted by the New York Times, he truly had no idea what he was doing. Eventually, as the eatery's profits continued slipping, he became desperate enough to solicit ideas from anonymous Dilbert fans over the internet. What he received in response were primarily jokes. One particularly popular suggestion was that Stacy's at Waterford host a nude volleyball tournament on the premises. Needless to say, this was another dead end. But Adams had one idea of his own. As time went on, he became increasingly obsessed with the dining room's lighting. According to him, this was the most important factor in any restaurant's success, even more so than food quality. A consistent point of frustration for him were the building's large windows, which made consistent lighting impossible. So his giant idea was to get rid of all of the natural light. Over the following months, he and his staff met up with dozens of interior designers, none of whom were able to provide them with the adequate curtains needed to fully block out the sunlight. After a while, Adams was forced to give up on this idea as well. In a last desperate attempt to save the eatery, Scott tried to market it using the one thing he had always found success with: Dilbert. He set out blank comic panels at the tables and encouraged guests to draw their own cartoons, as well as setting up a TV with a constant loop of Dilbert comic strips playing at all times. There was even a rumor that he had plans to make employees dress up in Dilbert-inspired uniforms, but Adams flatly denied it. And ultimately, it was too little too late. Stacy's at Waterford was eventually forced to close after being boxed out by nearby competitors, and the original Stacy's Cafe shut down not long after. Adams' other food-based business venture was one that he put even more of a personal stake into. Health and nutrition have always been factors which he credits heavily for his career success. As a longtime vegetarian, Scott felt that he had a duty to his audience to help them eat better. In 1998, he founded Scott Adams Foods, a company through which he created one product, the Dilburrito. As the name implies, this was a Dilbert-themed microwavable burrito created with the help of Jack Parker, a man who had a long career in the food industry. The product came in 4 flavors: Mexican, Indian, barbecue, and garlic and herb, each one containing 100% of the consumer's recommended daily vitamin intake. According to experts, it is not necessarily advisable for someone to eat all of their vitamins in one meal, as this can lead to an excess of certain substances. Nevertheless, Adams soldiered on with the idea, even creating a website to promote it. This is where he wrote about his plans for the Dilburrito, giving us some insight into just how important he believed this business would be for the human race. He even hired some Ukrainian developers to make a video game based off of the product. It was simple. The player was required to guide Dilbert into exercising and eating healthy foods in order to outlive his nemesis. Succeeding in this task would reward the player with an animation of Dilbert dancing on his enemy's grave. Despite Scott's lofty ambitions for the Dilburrito, the product flopped hard when it was released to the market. He was able to admit to some of its flaws, namely that the vegetable and bean content was so great that it caused digestive problems for many customers. But in his autobiography, Adams blames the failure of the Dilburrito primarily on rival food companies, who he alleges hired agents to go into grocery stores and hide his product in the back of the freezer section. It's important to note that this claim of corporate gaslighting was unconfirmable, and the only place I've ever seen it stated was by him. Scott Adams Foods soon ceased operation only a few years after being created, ending the cartoonist's dreams of changing the world. This appears to be a failure that still bothers him to this day. The Dilburrito was much more than just a microwavable lunch option. It was supposed to be a gift to mankind. In 2006, he married a woman by the name of Shelley Miles, from whom he gained 2 stepchildren. The couple enjoyed a quiet relationship before eventually splitting in 2014. It seems as though they remained on good terms after the divorce, and Adams even continued to be a fixture in their children's lives in the following years. In his free time, of which it appeared he had a lot of during the early to mid-2000s since drawing Dilbert took up very little of his daily schedule, Scott fancied himself something of a philosopher and life coach. After all, he was being paid a great deal of money for public speaking events. He has published many books over his lifetime, primarily regarding his views on the world. One of the earliest of these was the Dilbert Principle, which expounded on the idea that the least competent people at any company would be promoted to management to mitigate the amount of harm they could do. While that's a funny concept for a 3-panel comic strip, I find it amazing that people actually live by that philosophy. You might be noticing a pattern here. Anytime he wants to achieve success or help one of his struggling business ventures, Adams will attach the Dilbert name to it in hopes of getting it a wider audience. This makes sense as the comic has proven to be the most marketable idea out of any of them. But still, it's not the thing he's most proud of. In interviews, Scott Adams has stated that his true legacy will be his writings about religion. From 2001 to 2004, he published a duology of novellas titled God's Debris and the Religion War, which detailed his views on theology. Sort of. It's important to remember that Adams has always been an unreliable narrator when it comes to telling stories about his life, and that goes doubly for discussing his personal beliefs. The introduction for God's Debris explains this in his own words. The opinions and philosophies expressed by the characters in this book are not my own, except by coincidence in a few spots not worth mentioning. You won't discover my opinions by reading my fiction. God's Debris is framed around a conversation between two nameless fictional characters, the protagonist and a mysterious old man who, as the author states during the introduction, knows everything. The two discuss a laundry list of topics, all revolving around God and religion, with the all-knowing old man described in the book as a fifth-level human, making some truly bizarre assertions about the nature of reality which the protagonist slowly starts to believe over the course of the book. These include the idea that all religions are subconsciously aware that what they believe is wrong, and only claim to have faith in order to receive the earthly benefits of doing so. He also states that all of creation is the result of God blowing himself up just to see what would happen if he died, hence the title God's Debris. To give my writer's review of the novella, it is a meandering story of two characters asking questions that are meant to sound vaguely intelligent, but ultimately mean nothing at all. One particularly aggravating exchange sees the characters debating the difference between fantasy and reality. The old man argues that an object that the protagonist has physically interacted with is just as real as something like the Easter Bunny, since both of these things now exist only as memories. This ignores the fact that nobody has ever physically interacted with the Easter Bunny. Adams has described this book as a thought experiment, merely a series of ideas to ponder but not meant to be taken literally. However, the fact that he stated he believes some of the opinions expressed by the characters without specifying which ones leaves a lot of room for doubt. This is a frequent pattern when studying Scott Adams. He will often say outrageous things while downplaying and obfuscating how true he actually thinks they are. He'll say things he genuinely believes, except for the parts he doesn't, never clarifying which are which. One thing that he has been very upfront about is his belief in the power of words. Scott is a trained hypnotist, receiving his certificate in his 20s. Now, hypnotism is a somewhat controversial subject in the field of psychology. While studies have shown it may have some benefits in situations such as weight loss, quitting smoking, or even pain relief, it is far from a miracle cure for any of these conditions, and has proven ineffective in many scenarios. But Adams has complete faith in the practice, seemingly likening it to some form of mind control over the plebs. Hypnosis treats people as if they are machines that can be programmed. If you provide the right inputs, you get the outputs you want. He has on multiple occasions referred to the human race as moist robots, who will bend to the will of anyone who can string together the right series of words. In fact, he claims to have put this into action within God's Debris, stating in the introduction for its sequel that he, quote, used a variety of hypnosis techniques in an attempt to produce a feeling of euphoric enlightenment in the reader. My writer Jack says he didn't feel this way after reading the book. Another one of Scott's deeply held beliefs is the power of affirmations. Essentially, this is a practice in which a person repeats their goals to themselves every day in order to help them succeed. In the past, when the cartoonist has spoken about affirmations, critics have accused him of believing they are some form of magic. Adams has strongly denied this, stating that he simply believes them to be helpful in focusing on one's goal. This may sound reasonable enough until you read the section of his autobiography in which he gives an example when affirmations have worked in his life. My first affirmation was, "I, Scott Adam, will become rich." The long version of the story involves two ridiculously lucky stock picks that came to me out of nowhere in separate flashes of something that felt like intuition. I invested nothing in the first stock because of a paperwork snafu, and it subsequently went to the moon. I bought and quickly sold the second stock for a respectable gain and watched from the sidelines as it too zoomed up. Despite Scott's protests to the contrary, this sounds like someone casting a magic spell on their brain to tell them which stocks to invest in to become rich. And since he claims to have either pulled out before the stock's peak or failed to invest at all, he can't technically be proven wrong, which is also a pattern when researching for this video. Another instance in which he claimed affirmations helped him was when he developed focal dystonia during his early years of Dilbert.
And what would happen is, as soon as my hand would come down to the paper with a pencil in it, the pinky would start spasming. And the hand was perfect otherwise. There were no problems structurally with the hand. It wasn't carpal tunnel. And found out later, when I found a doctor who turns out was an expert on this very thing, focal dystonias, that it's a brain problem. And the solution, they said, was to stop doing what you're doing, which in my case meant don't be a cartoonist anymore.
Despite being told that there was no known cure or even a treatment, Adams persevered. He tried various workarounds such as drawing with his left hand or tying his pinky to his ring finger, but nothing worked. It seemed as though the cartooning career was about to be over before it even began. Eventually, though, he developed a technique to aid his recovery.
And I would sit at boring meetings for hours at a time, and below the table I would just touch my pen to my pad of paper and then lift it up before the spasm happened, because I could, touch it. But, and then I got to the point where I could leave it there for a second before the spasm happened. And eventually I just kept doing it until that second would become 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And at about 5 seconds, it just, whatever was wrong with my brain remapped. And it just took the problem away.
Yes, through sheer force of will, Scott Adams had cured himself of an incurable condition. While this is also a difficult claim to verify, I have to give him the benefit of the doubt because enough reputable sources have reported on it, and it's safe to say that he at least suffered from focal dystonia and overcame it. As Adam writes in his book, "My hand doctor said I'm part of the literature on this topic now, although my name is not mentioned." But just because this particular affliction had ended, it didn't mean he was in the clear just yet. In 2005, Scott began to experience difficulty speaking in social settings, with words coming out choppy and oftentimes getting caught in his throat altogether. He reportedly spent nearly 6 months visiting various doctors, none of whom could offer him a proper diagnosis. Finally, he decided to consult the internet, at which point he was finally able to give his condition a name: spasmodic dysphonia. When he consulted his doctor, he was met with the same prognosis as his pinky. There was no cure, and he would never speak properly again. He remained this way for 3 years, barely able to talk to anyone, even his own family, in a conversational setting. He more often than not was forced to use single-syllable words or a crude form of sign language to convey his needs. He was able to improve somewhat via a weekly treatment in which Botox was injected directly into his throat, but this was hardly a solution to the problem. It probably goes without saying that this was a difficult time period for Adams, as he became more and more reclusive and shrank back into his own world. Eventually, though, he was alerted to a highly experimental surgery in which his vocal cords would be completely severed from his brain, so he could re-establish connection over the course of a months-long recovery. Despite being informed that there was a 15% chance that he could permanently remove his voice altogether, Adams decided to take the risk. Fortunately for him, this ended up being the right decision, as he claims his voice actually came back stronger than it was before. Scott also credits affirmations with this recovery, although it's not entirely clear how the two are connected. While his voice had returned, there were still some lasting effects from his years without it. As he puts it, For 3.5 years, I experienced a total disconnect from normal life, and a profound sense of aloneness despite the love and support of my family and friends. It was because of this that the Cartoonist decided to turn to the internet to fill the void. And this may have been the start of the long chain of dominoes that led to the end of Dilbert as we know it. As already established from his battles with the likes of Bill Griffith and Tristan Farron, Scott Adams does not enjoy being made fun of. And spending more time online meant more opportunities to see his name dragged through the mud. As social media continued to grow into the Goliath that it is today, people started taking notice of all the odd things Adams had been publishing. One early example came in 2011 when he wrote a blog post detailing his opinions on the men's rights movement, which somehow angered both sides of the political spectrum. I would like to speak directly to my male readers who feel unjustly treated by the widespread suppression of men's rights. Get over it, you bunch of pussies. The reality is that women are treated differently by society for exactly the same reason that children and the mentally handicapped are treated differently. It's just easier this way for everyone. You don't argue with a 4-year-old about why he shouldn't eat candy for dinner. You don't punch a mentally handicapped guy even if he punches you first. And you don't argue when a woman tells you she's only making 80 cents to your dollar. It's the path of least resistance. You save your energy for more important battles. This ignited a small firestorm online, downplaying how much of what he wrote he actually believed in, claiming he was just trying to be different. This, along with several other things he had written over the years, turned Adams into an internet oddity. One such place that began discussing him was the website Metafilter, where post after post was created lambasting the Cartoonist for anything ranging from his apparent misogyny to his ego. After a while, though, a mysterious account named Planned Chaos showed up to defend the Dilbert creator. Lots of haters here. I hate Adams for his success too, but some factual clarifications are in order. As far as Adams' ego goes, maybe you don't understand what a writer does for a living. No one writes unless he believes that what he writes will be interesting to someone. Everyone on this page is talking about him, researching him, and obsessing about him. His job is to be interesting, not loved. As someone mentioned, he has a certified genius IQ, and that's hard to hide. Pretty much immediately, people caught on to the fact that this was just Scott Adams in disguise. Metafilter users humored him for a little while, mainly relishing in the fact that they were able to make fun of the Cartoonist directly. Nobody is suggesting that Scott Adams is talented or interesting. He certainly is rich though, and if that isn't enough to earn your undying respect, then there's just no reaching you. Eventually though, Adams chose to reveal his true identity and retreated from the thread. He later went onto his blog to discuss the matter, playing it off as if it wasn't a big deal and the criticism didn't bother him. On the scale of immoral behavior, where genocide is at the top and wearing Spanx is near the bottom, posting comments under an alias to clear up harmful misconceptions is about one level worse than Spanx. This was just a taste of what type of pettiness Scott was capable of when his views were challenged. And if an obscure message board was able to rile him up that much, things got indefinitely worse when he became more active on Twitter during the mid to late 2010s. If we made it legal for kids to kill their bullies, a lot of problems would go away. We'd create new problems, sure, but how could those new problems be worse? This is a thought experiment, not a recommendation. Now that people had an unprecedented level of access to the Cartoonist, though, these musings would receive a flood of negative replies, a great deal of which would be responded to by Adams. Strangely, he has referred to many of his critics as Keith, which from my best guess seems to be a reference to his hatred for the TV commentator Keith Olbermann. However, not all of his posts have been framed as these bizarre thought experiments. Once he made a tweet talking about why the Dilbert TV show had been cancelled all those years prior. While he had already spoken about this in 2006, his newest reasoning was much different than that given in the old interview. I lost my TV show for being white when UPN decided it would focus on an African American audience. That was the third job I lost for being white. Once again, this received a significant amount of pushback, which the millionaire artist couldn't help but respond to. This is merely a small sample of the sorts of things Adams would post to Twitter, and truth be told, we could spend hours simply reading his tweets. But there is one more that is worth bringing up purely on how brazen it was. In 2018, Scott's ex-stepson Justin tragically passed away from a fentanyl overdose at just 18 years of age. Fast forward to 2022 when a mass shooting took place in Highland Park, Illinois, and Adams felt the need to connect the two events. When a young male, let's say 14 to 19, is a danger to himself and others, society gives the supporting family two options. 1. Watch people die. 2. Kill your own son. Those are your only options. I chose number 1 and watched my stepson die. I was relieved he took no one else with him. It goes without saying that this shocked the internet, and to this very day, I still don't even understand what he was trying to get at. He only dug his hole deeper when the thread continued, talking about how there was no cure for these troubled young men and the only hope was to create some sort of area away from society where they could harm each other. Adams was scrutinized heavily for these statements as people simply couldn't believe he would speak so callously about a deceased boy he had a partial hand in raising. He was unrepentant though, digging his heels in with every negative response he received. Like all the other controversies, this too eventually blew over, but it still remains a stain on his online reputation. Of course, there is a single factor for Scott Adams' newfound success on Twitter in the mid-2010s: Donald Trump. Which is where a lot of Zoomers probably found out about the Dilbert creator in the first place. I pretty vividly remember immediately after Trump's presidential campaign began, Adams was fixated on the candidate. A large part of this plays into his hypnotism training and his moist robot theory of human behavior. You see, there is another pillar to his worldview, which is that there are people who have discovered the secret key to controlling a significant amount of the global population using just their words. He has dubbed these people master wizards. I see Trump as a modern-day wizard who is baffling the media because he is playing three-dimensional chess on their two-dimensional chessboard. Trump is talking directly to people's subconscious. Everything else he says is just a carrier signal. Now, those of you who are well-versed in online political rhetoric might find the phrase 3D chess familiar. In an ironic twist, it turns out that Scott Adams is actually the originator of the infamous 4D chess meme. Know Your Meme cites him as one of the very first individuals to circulate the claim. While it's technically unproven, it's hard to imagine that his initial statement didn't result in the spread of the phrase. By the way, do you want to know who else is a master wizard? Apparently Kanye West. Anyway, his support for Trump gave Adams a plethora of new topics to tweet about in the days to come, as he started receiving the most attention he had ever had since the heyday of Dilbert. One tweet from this era I found particularly interesting was when he implies that Hillary Clinton was connected with terrorists. If there are no sponsored terror attacks before Election Day, it means ISIS prefers Clinton. They have the means. Think about it. In addition, Adams made the claim that he feared for his life as a Trump supporter living in California.
I live in California, and it's not really safe to support Trump in California. I mean, it's physically not safe, and I mean that in a real way. I'm sort of personality that most things don't bother me. But bullying happens to be one of those things that does. And the Clinton side has gone full bully now.
As can probably be expected, these statements were not exactly popular. His previous odd posts and musings could easily be mocked and moved on from, but now he had thrown himself fully into the incredibly divisive 2016 political landscape, and people couldn't look away. And you gotta give him credit that he was one of the first people going around to mainstream media outlets telling them that Donald Trump would win. Because he got the last laugh last time around, he became even more outrageous in 2020. If Biden is elected, there's a good chance you will be dead within the year. Republicans will be hunted. Police will stand down. While many continue to mock his thought experiments, this behavior began to worry his longtime fans. Adams had always been a strange person, but his latest ramblings were on a whole other level. They wondered what had changed to cause such a rapid decline in his mental health. It was around this time that Adams started WhenHub Interface, a platform in which theoretically users could be connected with experts in any field for one-on-one video chats. He had actually started this service in 2017, although nothing had come of it at that time. And since it was 2020, of course there was a cryptocurrency attached to it dubbed When Token. Strangely, he also decided to make his second wife, Instagram model Christina Basham, the company's vice president. This was solely based on the fact that she was skilled at growing her social media following. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the entire website fell into disrepair only a few months after the 2020 rebrand, and hasn't been heard from since. He and Basham would also seem to divorce 2 years later. This was just the latest in a long line of failed businesses Scott had created, and it was something he could afford to do. As long as Dilbert was still being published in newspapers on a daily basis, a consistent stream of revenue would keep flowing in to fund whatever scheme he cooked up next. But there was a change in the air, as he would go on to ruin his own life for no reason. As Scott Adams continued incessant political Twitter postings, public perception on him soured at a rapid pace. It didn't help that Dilbert, or comic strips in general for that matter, were hardly the cultural juggernauts they had once been. Behind the scenes, his publishers were probably starting to see Adams as more of a risk than a benefit, and started looking for any reason to cut him loose. In February of 2023, Scott discovered a poll which asked Black people if they agreed with the statement, "It's okay to be white," to which only 53% of those asked said yes. The Cartoonist was outraged by this, going onto a live stream to make his thoughts perfectly clear.
So if nearly half of all blacks are not okay with white people, according to this poll, not according to me, according to this poll, that's a hate group. That's a hate group. And I don't want to have anything to do with them. And I would say, based on the current way things are going, the best advice I would give to white people is to get the hell away from black people. Wherever you have to go, just get away.
Not only did it start another barrage of outrage, but newspapers across the country opted to drop Dilbert from their lineup. His then current distributor, Andrews McMeel Universal, also cut ties, and Penguin Random House canceled his upcoming book release. This was the end. Scott Adams had killed the golden goose that was Dilbert, effectively torpedoing his career that he had spent years building, in a single day. For his part, the former professional cartoonist didn't seem to think he had done anything wrong. He chastised the publishers who dropped him on Twitter, claiming they had offered no disagreement about his point of view. In the FAQ section of the Dilbert website, he returned to his old tried-and-true technique, pretending he hadn't actually meant what he said, at least not entirely. Why did Dilbert get cancelled? If you believe the news, it was because I am a big ol' racist. I recommend staying away from any group of Americans that identifies your group as the bad guys, because that puts a target on your back. I was speaking hyperbolically, of course, because we Americans don't have an option of staying away from each other. But it did get a lot of attention, as I hoped. More than I planned, actually. So as he put it, it was just a thought experiment, bro, and he planned for this to happen as a 3D chess move with his wizard hypnotist high IQ brain, and all you moist robots are just pawns he's in control of. And this brings us to current day. So where is Scott Adams now? Well, since he has retained 100% of the rights to his comics IP, he still continues to publish Dilbert to his paid subscribers under the title Dilbert Reborn, alongside his other series, Robots Read News.
I'd like to submit a formal complaint about all the racism in this workplace. Oh wow, I'm so sorry. It's the white people, isn't it? We totally suck. I feel as if I personally owe you some reparations. We're all colonizers who are descended from slave owners. It's a stain that can never be removed until everyone who looks like me has been banished to hell. Tell me which cracker did this to you. No one was racist against me. You all seem to be racist against yourselves, and frankly, it's creepy. How can we make it up to you? See, you're doing it again.
And of course, he is still tweeting about politics, as you would imagine. If he at least saves some of his money from the height of his success, it's likely he will be okay financially for the rest of his life. But his professional and personal reputations have been destroyed beyond repair. Scott Adams simply couldn't leave well enough alone, and allowed his need to be a contrarian to destroy everything he had built. I think the best way to sum up this entire story would be a line that caught my attention while reading through his now humorously titled book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. Sometimes the only difference between crazy people and artists is that artists write down what they imagine seeing. In the past few decades, hardly a week has gone by without a stranger on the internet questioning my mental health. The rational part of my brain knows that if enough people suggest I might be crazy, I need to consider the possibility.